Welcome to the Compliance Without the Boring Bits webcast. Say goodbye to dull compliance talks. Join seasoned pros Gustav and Markus as they share 50 years of real-world compliance experiences, success stories, and insights in some engaging minutes. No slides, no fluff, just practical tips and lively discussions you can enjoy with your coffee or on the move. Whether you're tackling global tax regulations or prepping for what's next on the mandate scene, we'll help you stay ahead without putting you to sleep. Join today and make compliance both fun and effective. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Compliance Without the Boring Bits.
Welcome to Compliance Without the Boring Bits, Gustav.
Thank you, Markus. So to explain what we're doing here, we really thought, we should have a conversation, an easy conversation with things that are easy to understand and without the boring parts as well, right? And so we thought we'd structure this as something with three parts, right? First, talk about what's going on, then some hot gossips, and then give some concrete tips as well for our audience, right?
And there's a lot going on in the market, as we know, right? So tell us a little bit about you.
Well, Gustav Gnosspelius, I'm a Swede living in Finland, and this is the right country for me. I love saunas, so I want to stay here.
Excellent.
Been working with e-invoicing most of my career. What about you, Markus?
Done it for 25 years. And the funny bit about the boring bits is that the continuous question I receive, how did you survive for so long in this very boring, dry topic? And that's kind of what brought me here. And that's why I'm really excited to discuss some of the things that are less boring. Because I don't think it's boring at all. I think it's quite interesting.
Exactly. And that's when you're a nerd. You get interested in this.
Oh, we call us nerds now? Okay.
I want to,
Excellent.
when I was a teenager, being a nerd was not cool. But nowadays, it is kind of cool.
Yeah. And being in compliance is even cooler. Because we're saving people.
So my wife, I went to this e-invoicing conference, and my wife says, how can you want to go and with so much excitement to an e-invoicing conference?
Wives don't get that. Wives don't get that.
No, 3 days in a room with no windows talking about e-invoicing, but it is fun when you're into it, right?
It is. And if you listen to people and what this topic does to them, and if you have some approach where you can take the complexity out of it, because the internet is literally crammed with all the complex explanations of what compliance really is. So let's try and take this out. Let's try and simplify this as much as we can and make it a little bit more fun, shall we?
Let's start, Jan. Let's go on to the real-life cases.
Thank you.
Let's get started and hear about real-life cases.
So I'd like to bring up a case I got from one of my customers, and actually I've seen this from several ones, where a supplier sent them an email saying that, hey, now in Germany, we have an e-invoicing mandate coming 2025. And because of this, we as suppliers, we have to send you an XML data file and a PDF as attachments via email to you.
Oh, I
so
like
you
where
now
this is going.
Got to be ready to receive the XML plus PDF in email from us.
Have you just heard how great his German is? Amazing. Do that again for me, please.
Yeah. So, and for me, this is wrong on so many levels. It's wrongly understood about what they have to do.
Yeah.
It's wrongly implemented with the email stuff. And there's going to be legal consequences as well. Like, how can you send 2 invoices and so on? What are your thoughts, Markus?
It's very much in line with my experience. And I've worked with governments. I've worked with taxpayers who are on the receiving end of legislation, obviously, and also worked with software and service providers over these many years. And the biggest issue is communication. What are we dealing with? We're dealing with a government that is trying to digitize processes that have been in existence for a long time.
And that's a good thing.
And that's a good thing, yes. But the problem is, it comes back to communicating. What are we trying to do? Be clear about it. I mean, that example you've just mentioned says the supplier has totally misunderstood what their duties are going to be.
For the benefit of our audience, I'm going to explain now what they did not understand. And please do not raise this boring thing for me now. So it's wrongly understood. Starting 2025, the supplier does not have to take any action. Only the buyer has to take the action. The buyer has to be able to receive invoices. So that's how the supplier had misunderstood this. Second, with the implementation, the supplier should not be sending an e-invoice as an email attachment. It is possible to do it in theory. It's fully legal to do so, but it's really taking a process that could be so much better, well optimized through e-invoicing networks and and butchering it by sending it via email attachments.
Slicing and dicing it, making it easier to help people understand what they can do in order to make it a straightforward process in an organized way, right?
And then the last part, it's the legal consequences. So if the supplier is sending two files, a PDF, a visual representation, and XML, sorry, I didn't mean to give you the finger there, Marcus, and an XML, they're basically sending two invoices to the buyer. So how does the buyer know which one to act upon, which one to archive, and so on, if these two files differ somehow?
Yeah, it is very important to really understand that implementing and responding to these kinds of initiatives that are driven out of governments requires communication, right? If you're a recipient of invoices, talk to your suppliers, right?
Yes.
Take a step back. Do not do something rush, and really do not force your will onto others. Sit down. Talk to your suppliers. They might not know what is expected from them. But in the overall context, what do suppliers want? They want to get paid. So tell them what you need them to do in order to be able to pay them.
And that's very true, because if they were to implement true e-invoicing that is integrated with your AP, that means they'll be able to pay their suppliers sooner as well, instead of having this email.
That is true. And I think what is overall important is for 20 years now, we've looked at the existence of e-invoicing legislation because it's always been there. So what we are seeing now is a new actor on stage. That's the government. The government has a different objective. So what is important for the trading partners is to keep the process alive, to keep the communication alive, and to work with what the government throws at them. And what is easier than to just sit down, get good information, dissect the information, and come up with a plan.
Together.
Yeah. Which brings us to another one. I mean, we have this very rather soft and murky mandate in Germany, but then we have one in the neighboring country of France, which has been on the horizon for a long time, delayed several times, which is unfortunately one of the things that happens with government mandates. But what are you seeing there?
So to give a brief overview here, I'm going to try to do this without the boring science.
Avoid the boring bits.
So Germany, as you said, very loose. The only thing Germany says, send an invoice, and that's it. France, on the other hand, they say we have to use a government portal. There are certain formats that have to be used. There are certain messages around the invoice that has to be used, and so on. And something that happened very recently in France was a change in the approach towards small businesses. So France, with the upcoming mandate, there are two terms. We have the PDP, which is us, Basware, and then our peers on the market, the service providers for invoicing. And then we have the PPF, which is the government portal. And the government now a couple of weeks said that, you know what, the government portal will not serve anybody directly. So anybody who wants to be compliant with the new e-invoicing mandates must get a service provider, such as Basware or somebody else, so a so-called PDP. And this really has ramifications, right?
The interesting part here is, I think, if we are looking back at the first countries in installing something like what France is installing, what Italy has installed a while back, shouldn't they have thought about looking at those countries that have done this for a long time, right? Because what I'm thinking is...
That's the boring part.
That's the boring part, but it's less interesting to reinvent the wheel, which is why it's not boring. And that's why I think it's so much easier, if governments really sat down and planned properly. Because what is happening now with removing the government's involvement, the direct involvement, which is what you just said, is that 7 million businesses in France now have to attack 70-odd service providers, EDPs, to solve the problem. Are we going to look at another delay?
You think?
I think so. Is that going to be possible? It's going to be challenging. I would vote for another delay, I would say. But we will see.
But with your experience, Markus, and you said, what about looking at best practices? What are the best practices? Where should France have looked?
I think having been involved with a lot of the early mandates in countries like Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, I think the most important part for a government is planning. Planning. Do not do anything rash. What do you try to do? If I go and interview some of those government representatives, it's more like a Me Too thing, then we have a clear objective of what we're trying to achieve. The suffering part is the taxpayers, the market. Because if the market can't work with clear instructions, timelines, and objectives, they're going to be lost.
And now we come back to communication again.
That comes back to communication. It's all about communication.
I got business after business after business asking me, what do I need to do in France? What do I need to do in Germany? What do I need to do in country X? And so,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so the bottom line is, what we are looking at when it comes to electronic invoicing in general, globally, it's a giant change management project. And change management lives from communication. You cannot change if you don't communicate. And I think that is true for the taxpayers, for the businesses. You need to communicate. It's true for the government. You need to communicate.
Towards whom?
Towards the market. This is what we intend. Do not just issue legislation. Think about the impact onto the market and then come back and say, this is how we want you to do this. This is how we want you to see this.
Do you have a good example of that?
A good example? No, I don't think so. Right. But I think you can go the very hard way, like Mexico did, posting a picture of a guy behind bars on their website back in the days to say, if you don't follow our rules, this is where you will end up. And who wants to end up in a Mexican prison? But you can also then do the very soft one like Germany now and throw the entire market into utter confusion. And that is not going to help anyone. So I think it's somewhere in the middle. And I believe learning from experience and bringing the people who've really done this for a long time. I mean, look at the two of us. We've spent far too much time in this topic, but we are probably and hopefully some kind of source and resource for those people who are interested in finding out what to do and really to prepare for the change management in a proper way. We can contribute, and I'd love to do this.
So
probably also
be out, be good looking in the world instead of being in the rooms without windows.
Who can't look. Oh, anyway. Wonderful.
Should we move on to some hot gossip?
I think we should move on to hot gossip.
It is time for hot gossip.
So, with hot gossip, we learned some weeks ago that the UK is starting, what was it, a digital transformation project.
Yes.
Excellent. Would you care to share any insights?
If I had all the insights, I would probably have a crystal ball here or something like that, or I would be incredibly busy answering all these questions. What is happening on a case-by-case basis now is that all these other governments that are running out of money, really, because that's one of the drivers, right? VAT is a source of income for the governments. And if you're low on cash, you try to improve it. And installing these kinds of processes and issuing that legislation is just a means to get more revenue in, collect taxes in real time. The UK is just one government that has issued a consultation, what to do.
And what is a consultation?
I think the consultation really is supposed to get in feedback from the market. How would you like us to do this? Which, by and large, what we just said is probably the right thing to do.
And not just through lobbying. I read they're going to do some kind of web page where you can give your comments.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. And I've contributed quite a number of documents to various different governments in the past. I think they probably ignored it because some of the things that I've written down in that they then actually did anyway. But I think that is going to just increase over the next few years because I believe there is just no option anymore. We cannot ignore the digitization requirements also on the government side.
So I'm going to throw you a question here, Markus. You say, the governments ignore your advice. So you said a driver is to close the VAT gap, basically, capture more of the tax that should be captured. But also with this comes an improvement in business processes because if you switch to e-invoicing, in the long term, businesses are going to save money.
Oh, absolutely.
So with this in mind, why would governments ignore your advice for, helping the businesses? Because we often see that the government mandates on e-invoicing favor the governments more than they favor the businesses.
I think you're probably taking me too seriously because if I say they ignore my advice, they probably don't care as much as I care about it. But I think the most important part here is that governments are embarking on these missions now in a reactive mode, which is right in the sweet spot of what you and I discuss on a regular basis. Do not be reactive, be proactive. Because if you're proactive, then you can actually take things forward in a structured and organized way. If you're being reactive, you're just doing something because you think or you believe you have to do this. Closing the VAT gap, as you just said, is a reality. These systems close the VAT gap. But in order to achieve your objectives, you also need to have metrics in place. Now, some of us might actually say, metrics, what do governments care about metrics? But you can already see that there is a difference between one government that is issuing a more relaxed approach because they just want to introduce the concept to the market and see how they react. Consultations are another thing. And then you see those governments who have a very clear plan where they want to go. And some of those examples you can clearly see in Latin America, where the governments are turning the tables towards and against the taxpayers and towards them to say, we want to control every business transaction in this market. That fights the shadow economy, that reduces fraud, that gives the government more control, to the point where you as a business might be faced with pre-filled tax returns. That's a totally new ballgame, and that's what this system enables.
And this is really exciting. I think this is something you and I should actually discuss more.
We will
one of those.
Definitely go on to this one.
But you spoke about LATAM now, and I'm thinking we have another country who shares the same queen or king as England.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, Canada.
With Canada. So what's going on there?
You're referring to Canada. There's an interesting thing. That's really gossip, because I don't think that there's anything concrete behind this. But Canada obviously looks into the opportunities of installing such a mandate. The interesting part here is that it's about trade more than about optimizing their own finance processes in the government, because obviously Mexico, the US, and Canada are part of a sort of free trade zone, with Mexico being very far advanced in their processing of invoices. And here is an interesting facet to electronic invoicing in such a controlled fashion. You could potentially, if you trusted each other's invoicing systems and the transactions and the control of the transactions, to replace trade information or customs documentation. So in order to avoid waiting for customs documentation to be created and stamped and whatever in a meticulous, sometimes manual way, trust your invoice transactions. Create a cross-border mechanism to exchange the invoice information. Clear your ships without it. Without the tax and customs documentation, or more the customs documentation, it's kind of an interesting view. And that's something where Canada has started some internal discussions, and we will see where this goes. In Latin America, between, for example, Brazil and Mexico, this has been on the horizon for a while now, and we'll see whether that materializes. But it's an interesting part.
But I think both of the North American countries, USA and Canada, they have neighbors to look up to. And if we now count UK as a neighbor to Canada, or Europe, maybe take it a bit far.
A very, very remote neighbor.
But the USA could look at their neighbor as well with Mexico.
No, absolutely.
What they've done.
Absolutely. And you look at the UK situation outside of the EU, and then hopefully, getting some more connections towards Canada and the parts on the other side of the Atlantic, that might be a way to go. And it might be a way into a closer trading relationship, who knows? But the most important part of the gossip is this is going to open up a lot more opportunities than we've had in the past in the paper world. Most definitely.
Absolutely.
Should we move on to the tips?
Let's do so.
Thank you.
Now it is time to share the tips.
And we are literally in the weather forecast. Because what I've heard today is that there is a tornado coming. Or was it a tsunami?
Yeah, so different people will say different things. And I think that's a good point you make with both tsunamis and tornadoes, because it is a tsunami of e-invoicing mandates and change regulations happening all over the world. And I think you can look at it as a tsunami because this is something that's being pushed from the outside on businesses, and they have to adapt. You don't have a choice not to adapt.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's a tornado raging on land with all the delays and all the complexities and everything that's happening here. So yeah, it would be both.
How do we prepare for the weather?
How do we prepare for the weather? Well,
in Finland, you should know, right? You're used to bad weather, adverse weather conditions, so you're always prepared, right? There's no bad weather.
There's no such thing as bad weather. It's only bad clothes. That's what we say in Sweden.
That's true. You know what we say in Hamburg?
Please tell me.
It's not stormy if the sheep still have curls. Okay. onto something now.
But onto like looking holistically, like if I'm a homeowner in a country that it might be hit by, or I know it's going to be hit by tsunami, and I know it's going to be hit by a tornado, I would, look holistically at my home and try to reinforce the what do you call it?
Foundations.
Yeah, the foundation, and like protect my home and make sure that everything is in place and I have the insurances and whatnot. I would not just look at, the tornado might hit my garden, but I'm not going to look at my house. This predictor go through my garden. No, I'm going to look at my whole house. Yeah. And if we translate that into businesses, that means they have to look at where are all the countries I'm active in, what's happening there, what are we doing about it, how can we not control, but steer this
correct
centrally.
Yeah. Have a standardized proactive approach, right? Because there's also this guy who's the caretaker of the house, right? And he will prepare the house accordingly and will guide the house through the weather conditions, if we want to stick with that topic. But the most important part is, and that's the tip from my side, change management is only going to be as good as the preparations for it. And a number of years ago, we spoke about this one role inside the organization called the global process owner, right? Mm-hmm. Because we felt that unless there is one person who's empowered by CFOs and CPOs, the chief procurement officers, to actually be the owner of that change, it's not going to work. And you and I have seen so many failed e-invoicing implementations, right? We've seen so many failed projects.
And the reason, I'm sorry for interrupting.
What do we do? No, absolutely.
The reason for this is that you said, well, what about the caretaker of the house? But companies don't have that caretaker. Most of the time, there are roles with vested interest in compliance, but there's nobody owning it in the company.
Yeah, and so the thing is really that what I would say as the ground rules, and maybe that's also a good start for our series here that we are trying to start. Where do we begin? And I think today was a really good way to start this journey, right? Because a digitization project, by and large, is a journey, right? And it starts somewhere. A number of years ago, a very good friend of mine who was a tax consultant, actually, he compared it to a ship that leaves the harbor and goes through very rough seas, maybe encounters tsunamis and tornadoes on the way, but at some point needs to weather the storm and come back into the harbor, which, if you transfer it into the financial world, is the year-end results, right? So if you want to make sure that whatever goes into your company's reporting at the end of this journey is clean and validated, you need to observe a whole host of things on the path. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and that's again looking at it holistically and so on. And I'm sorry for my listeners here to think, oh no, I don't want to do this. It's so much easier if we just get this, thing in Romania or Malaysia, whatever, fixed. But you can also look at it the other way, that there are people who want to drive digitalization in a company, but they always have to present a business case or value for the higher-ups to approve the cost of this project. But now they have an external driver where they can say, we have to do this. The government says we have to do it.
And so there's always the value of compliance, right? And I know you're going to say this is boring again. However, if you're being fined, it's no longer boring. It's not funny, because it carries reputational damages and all the kinds of things that are associated with it. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We need to make sure that our listeners understand that there is a way forward, and there is a good way forward, and there is enough experience in the market that they can draw from. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. They don't have to do all of these things themselves. So why don't we actually look at this one in the upcoming sessions? I'd be really excited to do this with you. What do you think?
Absolutely. And then, touch the whole end-to-end, which includes archiving, for example, and so on.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm sorry, Markus, I think we're too high level now where we say look at it holistically. That's a very easy thing to say.
Yeah, it's boring, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So let's go on and Belgium. Let's have a look at Belgium. Yeah. Belgium is another country coming up that I'm getting questions around already. So what's happening in Belgium is 2026, they're adopting PEPL for e-invoicing. And I told you earlier, I think their PEPL mandate is like PEPL with hand-holding or with training wheels. Because actually, if you're a buyer in Belgium, you will be able to connect to a government portal and download the e-invoice as a visual representation, as a PDF. Yeah. So they're making it a bit easier, aren't they?
Yeah, they're making it a bit easier, but then we don't have to simplify too much. because a government cleared or simplified invoice process does not mean that the invoice necessarily will book automatically. So this is also one thing that I would include in our tips section, really. If you're looking at solving this conundrum of government mandates, do not forget to look at what your objective is as a business, and that is to automate the invoice process.
And you told me yesterday as well, Gustav, an invoice that has been cleared by the government does not mean that that one is valid or free from fraud or nothing. The only thing that means is that the government check the taxes, that they look all right, or what have you in the country of question.
Absolutely.
So yeah, you absolutely need to have your processes and your touch thing in place.
Perfect. Time for wrap up?
Sure.
It is already time to wrap up.
So we talked about Germany, about how Germany is misunderstood. Again, let's
Germany's misunderstood. Very good. Yeah, I feel very misunderstood sometimes.
We talked about how France is the opposite.
Not misunderstood.
I misunderstand French. I'm in a lot of French calls, and I misunderstand them a lot. And then we touched upon Canada and Latin as well.
Don't forget the UK and Belgium.
Yes.
Also touched on those.
So I'm hoping this has been useful, what we were talking, trying to keep it more hands-on. And if you as listener or viewer of this want to hear more, then do sign up for this, right?
Yes, most definitely. Or get in touch directly. I mean, we are also two individuals that exist in the real world. I think
Good looking.
Well, speak for yourself anyway. But no, that's an important thing. And I think what I would like to just say is that going forward, as you said, we're looking at the entire end-to-end process. And one of the things that a lot of discussions today discard and ignore to an extent is archiving. Because in the entire world...
Boring part.
Very boring, because it's a different legislation, but it's a very important one to consider, particularly in the context of new formats. What do I have to put into my archive? Yeah. That's something to explore.
And that's a lot, it's a whole lot easier when you have a paper invoice and okay, the legislation is I need to store this paper invoice for 10 years. That's easy peasy. Yeah. But now when you do a digital, what is it you have to store, what kind of data and how and so on.
Yeah. And don't take the shortcut and print your electronic invoice and then make it a paper invoice, because that is not working.
All right. I think we're going over time. So thank you for this. Thank you everybody who joined and listened and watched us.
Thank you.